So let's start with the official welcome. Hello and welcome, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, our esteemed guests and speakers, all protocol observed. Thank you for joining us at this significant side event for the Committee on World Food Security CFS 49 today, where our aim is to rethink and repurpose and reform around the why and especially the how, and how we need to overhaul agricultural support for better food security and nutrition. By way of introduction, my name is Natalie Becker-Arkovic. I'm a storyteller and producer at Thought Leader Global Media, where we work with organizations having a positive impact. And today is all about making and translating commitments into true positive impact on the ground. I'll be guiding you through today, and we'll be outlining how, as I said, countries can repurpose national government support. And we have an incredible lineup of speakers for you. I'll give you a quick rundown. We are honored to be joined by Andrew Bavanik of the UNDP, Stephen Stone from UNEP, Marco Sanchez Catillo from the FAO, who will be delivering the opening remarks. And then we'll dive right into a panel discussion with Jonathan Brooks from the OECD, Maudar Gautam from the World Bank, His Excellency Jean-Pierre Senghor from Senegal's National Food Security Council, who's also an agronomist, and Ariana Giuliodori, Secretary General of the World Farmers Organization. We will also then close with remarks from Maximo Torreira from the FAO. And if you attended the United Nations Food System Summit 2021 in September, just a couple of weeks ago, you may remember me as one of the co-moderators of that event. It was a big opportunity for countries and global leaders and policymakers and constituencies to really commit to repurposing harmful support policies. And today's event really moving on and following on and using that momentum to translate those commitments, those powerful commitments, into action. Today's event is about building on that momentum and really translating the commitments made by the members and the constituencies from that day into action. And this is really today an example of how we take that forward and how you can take that forward. So we believe that repurposing agricultural support should be on top of the agenda at this event and going forward. I recently read a quote which really sums it up from a producer or farmer who was at the UN Food System Summit. And he said, "This is not the end of the process. It is indeed the beginning." We do know that the three agencies that wrote the report that today's work is based on began this work way before. And today we look forward to an engaging and revealing discussion with you and our esteemed panelists, looking at the challenges that need to be overcome, but also the solutions and the ways in which we can actually do that. Now, before we get started today, we have some housekeeping rules. There is translation in French and English available for you. For those of you who would like it during the session, simply click on English if you would like to hear the translation in English. Click on French if you would like to hear the translation in French. As I mentioned before, we are here today to hear from you as well, and our panelists cannot wait for your in-depth and engaging questions. So we encourage you to add your questions to the chat box, also to direct it to the speaker if you'd like to answer the question. Here are some hashtags we'd love to hear from you on our social media platforms. Hashtag CFS49, hashtag UNCFS. You will find those in the chat as well. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming the Global Head of Food and Agricultural Commodity System Strategy at the UNDP, Andrew Bavanik.
Good day, colleagues. It is a pleasure to join you to open today's side event on the opportunity and the urgent need to rethink how we tackle food systems and how we design and deliver effective agricultural support. A radical overhaul of the way governments financially support agricultural producers, small and large, is urgently needed on a global scale. The time now is particularly opportune, so we seize the momentum built by the UN Food System Summit. Currently, $540 billion, almost $500 billion, is spent by governments worldwide supporting producers. This figure is likely to reach almost $2 trillion by only 2030. 87% of this $540 billion a year in agricultural support includes measures that are price distorting and can be harmful to nature and health. 87%, That's $470 billion. It's a lot of money to be spent promoting and rewarding outdated practices rather than spending it on what we urgently need to fund for a sustainable future. What therefore now lies in front of us is a complex, intriguing challenge and an opportunity to rethink, repurpose, and reform agricultural support. There is no one-size-fits-all strategy. Each country will determine its own best method, but our analysis, together with UNEP and FAO, has identified a 6-step template, which will need all stakeholders to work together to achieve the goal. You will hear more about these 6 steps today from our technical experts as they share more detail about the policy guidance for repurposing and how doing so can help ensure food security and nutrition for all. What is important now is to learn from the past, understand how and why the current system is as it is. We know there are reasons for everything, and certainly for spending $540 billion. We must bring our collective experience on policy reform to the table to support the policy reforms proposed in the report. We face deeply entrenched power dynamics influencing these policy frameworks, and we need new ways of engaging governments and encouraging such reforms. Underpinning these new ways of promoting policy reform we need to develop is the need for collaboration and common purpose among all stakeholders. Powerful coalitions will be essential to break down barriers and create the transition we need. And it can be done. In New Zealand, for example, they transformed their agricultural subsidies in just 12 months. Our UNDP administrator, Achim Steiner, has pledged that UNDP will offer support to countries who want to repurpose their agricultural spending. He has stressed the importance of inclusive, participatory, and locally owned multi-stakeholder processes for the transformation of food systems. UNDP has collaborated with FAO and UNEP to develop a proposal for a facility to support member states respond to the call for more effective and inclusive multi-stakeholder collaboration for their food systems transformations. We believe it can also help support this needed in-country policy reform. We recognize the global importance and central role of the CFS for food transformation, and we are delighted and privileged to be here with you to explore how we can work together to tackle this pressing issue of our time. Thank you.
Natalie, unmute. Did you introduce me? I didn't catch it. Yeah?
There we go. Thank you so much, Andrew, for that introduction. And now, Stephen, we go over to you. I apologize for not unmuting myself. I should know better by now, and hopefully I will throughout the rest of this event. Over to you, Stephen Stone, to introduce you to our audience. You're the Chief Resources. You are the Chief of Resources and Markets branch at UNEP. Stephen, over to you.
Thanks very much, Natalie. Don't worry, it's the ultimate icebreaker in our day and age.
It's that or the catch, right?
Hard to miss and easy to catch. Thanks so much for facilitating this event, and really great to be here today. I'd also like to say it was a great outing to colleagues at FAO and UNDP producing this report together with others, OECD, World Bank on the line today. Many contributed to this report, and the timing was crucial. It landed 1 week before the UN Food Summit, and it was in the headlines everywhere. How can we possibly be spending $540 billion a year on agricultural support, over 2/3 of which is going in the wrong direction, harmful to human health, harmful to the environment? This is a wake-up call to all of us, and I think one of the amazing things at the UN Food Summit were these country commitments. You know, over 100 countries coming forward and saying, we are committed to sustainable food systems. So I think this report is very much part of our pathway forward. It's great to hear from our UNDP colleague about the commitment to the facility. I think that's a wonderful tool that countries can call upon, and certainly UNEP will be there to support it as well. I just want to say a few more things. You know, with 3.2 billion livelihoods depending on food systems, it is real for everyone. We're all consumers. Half the global population almost is a producer. So food is completely tangible to our lives. And in an age when fiscal space is constrained, money is so dear, we can't really afford to be investing in the wrong direction. That's one of the key take-home points from this report. We need to look at it as an opportunity to rethink, repurpose, and reutilize, reprogram these resources so that they increase resilience for countries instead of increasing the probability of future shocks and pandemics due to habitat loss and other elements. I want to say one other thing, Natalie and colleagues, which is that 2022 is a very big year for many of us. UNEP turns 50 in 2022. It's 50 years on from the Stockholm Conference, which was the very first time that the environment came into the lens of peace and conflict, the central core mission of the United Nations. In 1972, world leaders said the environment is material to our well-being. It's part of our livelihood. It's part of our life support. So again, coming back to agriculture, so key to our life support, to our sustenance, by drawing from the environment. And if it's not a symbiotic, reciprocal relationship, which creates wealth and abundance over time, it's going in the wrong direction. So a very good time for this reflection and really looking forward to the panel debate. Back over to you, Natalie.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for a really warm, insightful, and very grounded in our current reality opening remarks. It's good to be reminded of that and very basic idea and truth that nature supports us and gives us all we need. And all it asks in return is the same reverence of taking care of it. And one asks really, how did we come this far? But I guess this is where we are now. And these are ways in which we can reverse and restore, overall, redirect, and somehow be able to mitigate all of the effects that we as humans have created from nature and ourselves up until now. So that is what today is all about. And as you said, translating that into very practical examples that our audience here today can take home. And we are blessed to have an incredible lineup of speakers who we will meet a little bit more closely. But first, before our presentation by Marco Sanchez, we have a video to share with our audience. And this is really to set the tone and shows the state of the current government support to farmers. Thank you. And I hope that really took you to the core of the issues that we are dealing with today, and to go into more detail about that, and to introduce us to the 6 steps that this today's talk and discussion and panel is going to revolve around. I would like to introduce you to the Deputy Director of the FAO, Mr. Marco Sanchez Quetillo, who today is going to be presenting the main findings of the FAO UNDP UNEP report called A Multi-Billion-Dollar Opportunity, Repurposing Agricultural Support to Transform Food Systems. Marco, the floor is yours. You have to unmute.
Yeah, thank you very much, Natalie. And good morning, everyone, distinguished delegates and colleagues, fellow panelists. I'm really pleased to be able to present the findings and the main recommendations of the FAO, UNDP, and UNEP report. Let me try to share my screen so that we can go with this. Okay, just a second here. Okay, my screen. Okay, I suppose you can see my screen now. Natalie, can you please confirm that you can see my screen?
We can see the other.
Marco, we can see your screen, yes.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you very much. So as I was saying, the idea here is to be able to go around some of the main aspects of this report. The report that you all know, or most of you know, that was launched in September, a multi-billion-dollar opportunity, repurposing agricultural support to transform food systems. And my idea is
Sorry,
just
Marco.
to...
Marco,
yes.
Just to, we're seeing the other screen, your other monitor, so.
The folder.
The folder, yeah.
How about now?
You're still seeing the folder, Marco?
Let me see. Let me see what's going on here. Let me stop sharing and sharing again, okay?
Okay,
And that works.
that's great. We can see the screen now.
Full screen, okay.
Yes, we see it.
Perfect. Okay, so let me just try to walk you through the main elements of the report. And the idea that I have in mind is just to provide, a snapshot of the main issues and set the stage for my fellow panelists to take over and share their experiences on how we can actually go about repurposing and reforming agricultural support. So let me first then...
Marco, just to quickly say, we can see your notes, so just change the display settings.
Okay. Is that fine now?
Not
We
yet.
can still see the notes on the side.
That's very strange. Okay, let me see what I can do. Let me start sharing again. That's the issue with having two monitors.
Indeed.
Okay, let me do one more try. Otherwise, I think you, Craig, can share the screen and share the presentation.
Okay. It seems that we have a full screen now. We still see the notes on the right-hand side. There
Yes,
we go.
that's
Okay.
We have it.
Okay, so
Thank you.
let me then try to speed up a little bit in the interest of time here. Okay, so let me tell you that the way we approach the problem here is, we all know that food systems are very important. They support several of the SDGs. Obviously, those related to food security and nutrition, but also many others in the sustainability realms, right? Food systems had also made impressive strides in producing food to feed a growing population with more food safety. We acknowledge all those good things about food systems. However, what we notice is that food systems are showing limits because they are not properly managed and supported. For example, in this report, we argue that agriculture contributes to land conversion and biodiversity loss. It pollutes air and waterways. And it's also the leading source of greenhouse gas emissions, and that's a problem. Furthermore, the world produces enough food, as we all know, but around 3 billion people in the world do not have access to healthy diets. So there is a problem here, of course, and the main question we pose is, how do we fix these issues? And as everybody is speaking today, we need to transform our food systems, of course. Now, there are several entry points to transform food systems. There are different solutions. And we think that agricultural support is one of them. Support given to farmers in particular, because there are different types of support. But that support that the farmer gets is not being fairly distributed in the world. And has also promoted some farming practices that are harmful to nature, to nutrition, and to human health. So what do we then do in front of this problem? And this is the question that the report tries to answer. And we argue that one of the answers is simple. We need to rethink and repurpose agricultural producer support. Now, it's very important that we understand what we mean by repurposing. We don't want to really confuse this concept with eliminating support. Repurposing in our report means that we reduce support measures that are inefficient, that are unsustainable, and inequitable in order to replace them with measures that are completely the opposite. This means that support, of course, is not eliminated, but reconfigured. And for doing that, we also need reforms. We need to change the rules of the game. We need to change laws, regulations, and institutions to achieve that. Then the next question that emerges here is, how do we do that? How do we do all these reforms? Well, this is exactly what we try to do together with UNDP and UNEP and other collaborators in the report, try to answer the how-to. Now, in order to know the magnitude of the problem, let me share some evidence that makes it very clear where we are. Agricultural support mostly targets farmers individually, okay? And that's very important to keep in mind. So worldwide, support to farmers corresponds to $540 billion yearly on average. Now, as you can see in the yellow bar in this graph, more than half this amount, which is almost $294 billion, is provided to farmers through price incentive policies. I will explain what that means. Now, the rest are fiscal subsidies that target farmers individually, and this represent about 70% that are given to farmers when the subsidy is coupled, we call it coupled or related to a specific crop or a specific input. Now, of course, farmers have reason to view these policies as good policies, right? For example, a price incentive or a subsidy, fertilizer subsidy, let's say, reduces the cost for them. And that's a good thing for them, of course. Or for example, a trade agreement that guarantees access to markets for a crop will probably prompt many farmers to invest in that crop. That's a good thing as well. So what is the problem then? Well, as we argue in this report, take for example, price incentives, those that are reflected in the yellow bar in the graph. Price incentives are the result of border measures, okay, and market interventions. And here we are talking about, for example, export tariffs, import taxes, duties, quotas, or fixed or floor prices. All trade policy instruments you can think of go there, and that keeps producers' prices above the market level. And the problem with this is that there is a distortion in the prices. There is a distortion that leads to trade, production, and consumption decisions that may not be the best or the most optimal. Now, fiscal subsidies, the other bars that you see in this graph, tied to the production specifically, can lead to negative environmental outcomes. For example, through an overuse of natural resources or the promotion of monoculture. But some of these policies can also be adverse to nutrition. They can bring about nutrition outcomes that are not more desirable. For example, by disproportionately fostering production of staples versus fruits and vegetables. Now, one important thing that we need to notice in this graph is, in addition to these measures, governments also support agriculture and producers more collectively, not only individually, more collectively, through the provision of general services and public goods. And here, including, for example, infrastructure, research and development, and so on. This type of support, we think, is less distorting, is more equitable, and returns are higher in the medium to long term. Unfortunately, as you can see in the gray bar in this graph, this support is only $110 billion yearly. And that's something we need to look at carefully in any repurposing strategy. Now, how countries support agriculture, of course, varies widely according to their policy objectives, and also tends to change depending on the development of the country. And this graph shows that very clearly. In high-income countries, for example, you have there high-income countries, middle-income countries, and low-income countries. And these bars represent how they are promoting or supporting agriculture directly to the farmers. In high-income countries, for example, as you can see, most support to farmers is through price incentives, but the trend has been downward until very recently. Distorting measures have been more prominent in middle-income countries, where price incentives and other support linked to production, especially input subsidies, now account for over 10% of agricultural production value on average. Now, in low-income countries, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, fiscal support to agriculture is minimal, and the farming sector has actually been penalized, even more so in the past. by price distorting policies that keep producer prices low to protect, obviously, the poor consumers. The most emission-intensive commodities, such as beef, milk, and rice, or unhealthy ones like sugar, receive the most support in the world, which also hinders production diversification towards more nutritious foods. Keeping support as usual, let's say that if we take this picture today and we project it to 2030, what we can see is that global support to farmers would reach almost $1.8 trillion by 2030. Now, while this trajectory is very dangerous, on the one hand, removing agricultural producer support altogether would not be an option either because of important trade-offs. Let me walk you through some of these trade-offs so that you understand what we are talking about here. The report projects what would happen if global agricultural support measures were to have been removed by 2030. The results show an overall reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to keeping support as usual, as this graph shows. This result, of course, is mostly driven by the global elimination of border measures, as you can see on the left-hand side of the graph, which will result in an increase in crop and livestock production. However, there will also be a shift towards more confined feeding operations with less deforestation and land conversion for pasture globally, and an associated fall in greenhouse gas emissions. But the overall reduction in emissions globally will not come without important trade-offs, as that's the point we want to make here. As this table shows, with all support being apparently dismantled by 2030, as we analyzed in the report, global crop production would fall by 1.3% and livestock production by 0.2% by 2030, with rising prices in most scenarios. Again, this is a scenario where we are removing all forms of support represented in this table. This result is mostly driven, of course, by the elimination of fiscal subsidies, as you can see in the results. Now, with agricultural production falling, it is unsurprising that less land and other natural resources are used and that emissions are, of course, projected to decline. But removing all support would also hurt farmers' income, particularly in developed countries. This, of course, would affect global income inequality, and there could also be adverse effects on food consumption, as we can see in the next slide. Here we have the estimated impact of removing border measures and fiscal subsidies on global per capita consumption by 2030. The elimination of these forms of agricultural producer support is projected to have disparate effects on global per capita consumption of various food groups, depending on the type of support, of course, and the economic classification of the country. For example, as you can see in this graph, removing border measures is expected to lead to higher per capita consumption of some food items, such as sugar, as you can see in the left-hand side graph, which tends to be highly protected. Now, on the other hand, removal of fiscal subsidy largely has a negative income effect on farmers, which contributes to lower per capita food consumption more across the board. And that includes, for instance, vegetables, oils, fruits and vegetables, and so on. Now, in light of this evidence, removing agricultural support would come with trade-offs for food security and nutrition, but business as usual is not an option either. So the question then is, how do we do this? How do we go about this? Well, we need to repurpose agricultural producer support to use the same public resources in ways that achieve better food security and nutrition outcomes with more sustainability. To end, in the report, we propose 6 steps to implement an agricultural producer support strategy that is coherent with healthy, sustainable, equitable, and efficient food systems, and entail in every step of the pathway, in every step of this strategy, engagement of stakeholders, particularly small farmers and vulnerable groups. Now, the guide starts with the estimation of the support already provided, which is step 1 in this screen. How it impacts agriculture on food systems is something that we need to estimate in a second step as well. Step 3 to 5 represent the main actions in the formulation, finalization, and implementation of the repurposing strategy. In step 3, the identification of reforms takes place. In step 4, the outcomes of these reforms are forecasted. And in step 5, the formal adoption of new laws, enactment of regulations, and implementation of required changes to institutions takes place. Step 6 pertains to the monitoring and evaluation of the repurposing strategy after implementation. The implementation of these steps has to be informed by the peculiarities of the context. Now, it sounds easy, but there will be challenges, of course. Obviously, every repurposing support strategy will face very important challenges, in particular resistance, institutional gaps, and bureaucracy. So the report also proposes solutions to overcome them, including stakeholder engagement, working with transparency and communication along the way, and working for the concrete socioeconomic context. We hope that these 6 steps can serve as guidance for governments and to leverage urgent action going forward. And I also trust that my fellow panelists will also shed more light on how these steps can be implemented in practice based on their unique experiences. Thank you very much.
Marco, thank you so much for that presentation and for truly setting the context for what we are dealing with. Also, thank you for introducing us to the 6 steps, which are really there to repurpose with stakeholder engagement. And today, of course, we have a cross-section of stakeholders who are graciously joining us, giving their perspectives as our speakers and panelists, where we are going to be unpacking this deep and important work, looking at the challenges, as Marco said, and also the solutions and the ways forward, so that we can really translate the commitments into actions and help you, the audience, to do this, to get this done. And without further ado, I'd like to address the first question to the head of the Agricultural and Resource Policy Division in the OECD's Trade and Agriculture Directorate. They also produce the annual Agricultural Monitoring and Evaluation Report and Biennale, review of fisheries, and they conduct analysis of how government policies can improve the productivity, sustainability, and resilience of the agriculture and fisheries sectors. So, of course, Jonathan Brooks, I am addressing the first question to you. So for our audience, just a reminder, we want to hear from you after we complete our first round of questions with our esteemed panelists. We want to hear from you in the chat box. So make sure that you post your questions. You can start posting them now. And remember to add the name of the panelist or speaker you would like us to address the question to. Jonathan, referring to the 6 steps and considering the 6-step guide to repurposing and reforming agricultural producer support we have just seen Marco introduce, looking at steps 1 and 2, which really refers to the need to estimate the level and the type of support already provided to farmers. And this is in order to assess its impacts and how to actually start a repurposing strategy. Now, the OECD has developed what is the most widely adopted methodology to actually do that. And it's now being used in several countries with the support of various international institutions. So getting to the question, Jonathan, how critical is it to get this measurement done? And what can international organizations do to push further on this evidence generation and really close the data gap, which is still a challenge and still so wide in so many regions of the world?
Well, thanks, Natalie, for raising that very important question. And the answer is, of course, that it is absolutely critical. And at OECD, we're pleased to join our FAO colleagues and UNEP and UNDP at this critical juncture in trying to maintain momentum created by the UN Food Systems Summit. So you're right. I mean, at OECD, for more than 30 years, we've been computing the support that countries provide to their agricultural sector. And our agricultural monitoring and evaluation work, which looks at policies in 54 countries, accounts for about 3/4 of global value added. So as Marco noted, those countries provide a lot of support to agriculture. We measure that as a total of $720 billion per year. of which 540 billion is the transfers to producers that Marco referred to. About a third, 270 billion, is in the form of market price support, or these price distortions, again, that Marco referred to. And there's about $450 billion a year of taxpayers' money. And so we're pleased to see those numbers provide crucial input to the report of the three institutions. And broadly, I would say that our analysis concurs that agricultural policies are not addressing these wider needs of food systems. And similarly, our own analysis recommends that governments should phase out the price interventions and those market distorting forms of producer support that make environmental outcomes worse, not better. It should target income support to those farm households that are most in need. And then finally, an aspect of this repurposing agenda is to reorientate public expenditures towards investments in public goods and innovation systems. So I think this is fully consistent with the repurposing agenda as set out by Marco. Now, you raised the question of data and what can we do there. Well, I think the first thing is really expanded country coverage is going to be important. So in addition to the 54 countries that we cover at OECD, our colleagues at the Inter-American Development Bank have comparable information for 19 Latin American countries. FAO has information for 13 African countries, but I think we can do more in terms of our coverage of Asian economies. And so we're pleased to work with a consortium of IOs, FAO and IDB, but also IFPRI and the World Bank, to provide a more complete picture of protection and support. A second gap, I think, concerns evidence on relative income. So a lot of resources, we heard this $550 billion a year, are transferred to farmers in the form of price support or through direct payments. Now, a lot of that is really social transfers, but in many cases, we have a poor idea of the extent to which farmers are actually poorer than the consumers and taxpayers paying for the transfers. And having an understanding of really who's gaining and who's losing is essential if policies are to be equitable and inclusive. Finally, in terms of the repurposing budgets, I think we have a good understanding of how money is being spent. But the next step really is to get better data on how it should be spent. So one option is to repurpose that spending within agriculture. So of the $450 billion approximately that we see spent, budgetary spending, only 1/6 is spent on items that could be scaled up. Marco made the point that we can't eliminate, and it would be foolish to eliminate that spending, but we're spending $76 billion on investments in R&D, biosecurity and infrastructure, and a relatively tiny $1.5 billion on payments for environmental services. So those expenditures could be strengthened in many cases, and we need enhanced measurement of exactly what countries are doing there, and also how effectively those monies are being spent, because it's not just about spending your money, it's also about how it's implemented in order to be effective. And the other option, of course, is to repurpose spending beyond agriculture, including for wider food system objectives and for social priorities. So priorities there, which would need to be costed and where improved data would be necessary, include payments for abating greenhouse gas emissions and for nutrition programs. So there are a wider range of social priorities. At OECD, we're continuing to invest in data improvements, and we're of course eager to keep working with FAO and other international organizations to improve both our country coverage and the scope of measurement so that we can get a grip not just on how money is being spent, but how it should be spent. So I hope that starts the discussion rolling. Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you so much for that in-depth and comprehensive answer, Jonathan Brooks from OECD. also, this is such deep and comprehensive work that it is really helpful to have these 6 steps to unpack them with, and to be able to give our audience today concrete answers and country solutions to be able to implement these solutions in their own countries. And we may be coming back to you also with a question on perhaps about how the UK is currently doing this. So Jonathan, thank you for that. And now moving on to steps 3, 4, and 5. We're going to direct the next question to the lead economist with the agriculture global practice at the World Bank. He also has a PhD in agriculture economics and experience across many parts of the World Bank over the past 25 years, including development economics and agricultural policies, independent evaluation, and with operations units in Africa and South Asia. The main focus of his current work today is on agricultural and food policy analysis and development strategy. So he's certainly well placed to answer very well a lot of our questions today. And on that note, we're looking forward to the questions from our audience. Madhur Gautam, lead economist of agricultural global practice at the World Bank, welcome.
Thank you, Natalie. I hope the sound is clear at this time.
Thank you.
Great.
It is.
Excellent.
It is clear, and we will let you know if it's not, and I'm sure we'll be able to do something about it. So, Madhur, moving on to steps 3, 4, and 5, to which Marco referred, of the repurposing guide. We see the trajectory to follow to ensure that the outcomes of the new policies and incentives are, first of all, more effective, more sustainable, and healthier. This is the main objective, and the analysis, like other recent studies undertaken by yourselves, the World Bank, simulates the impacts of the policies at a large aggregate scale, but it also insists on the need to account for country specificities or peculiarities for devising an effective repurposing strategy. So this is key, that there is country specificity. So the question we'd like to direct to you, Madhur, is how do we translate these global recommendations down into country-specific work? And what do you believe are the key ingredients for the design of a successful, implementable repurposing strategy on the ground in the country?
Thank you, Natalie. First, thank you for the kind introduction, and thanks to Phil for the invitation to join this discussion. As Andrew Bravarnik mentioned this morning, there's no one size fits all. So at the global level, we are interested in finding out what we all do as to how it contributes to the global commons. And climate, of all things, is one of the biggest challenges that faces food security, faces agriculture. And here, what we do individually matters. So it is important to look at the global level, but the real action has to take place at the country level. That's because the policies are made at the country level. They are a sovereign issue. They are context specific. So it is important we understand what the situation is in a country, what level of development they are, at what level of development they are, what the local agroecological circumstances are, social circumstances. So that the solutions have to be customized. Nevertheless, there are some important principles. There's a lot of cross-learning, peer-to-peer learning, because the countries are not in this all alone. They do have to learn from each other. So it is in that context that we have also been doing, along with IFPRI, analysis to look at what might be the options. So I think both Marco and Jonathan have laid out the scale of the problem. And now what we want to do is, our question was, well, what exactly can the governments do? So at least initially, we started to look at it at the global scale. And if you don't mind, I just want to share a few slides that kind of highlight the complexity of approaching this problem, because we want to repurpose, but where do we want to repurpose it towards? And so give me a second. I hope I can do this without a glitch, and it will be a smooth transition. I hope you can see the presentation.
Yes, we can see the presentation. Thank you, Madhur.
So we want the food system transformation that requires a systemic shift in policies that align, that determine the incentives for producers and other actors in the food system are a key driving force. So how do you realign those incentives? So we look at the work, and I think Marco has already laid out what the impacts of potential removal of subsidies would be. So removal of subsidies is not a choice, and I think he's laid the ground for that extremely well. And the 2 points that I would like to raise is just to remind us that one, the transfer efficiency, the question is what do we actually buy for that money, is very low. For every $15 we spend, we get $1 in return in terms of value added. That transfer efficiency of 15% is extremely low. So for the 430 billion that's posed as a producer subsidies, for example, producer support, that's the impact. So clearly, that needs to be improved and identify what's going to happen. The other main point is that there are a lot of gains to be had from changing the way we do things and not do some of the harmful things that we do. But will it in the end contribute to bending the arc on climate change? And here we need to do a lot more. The actions can matter, but I think we need to repurpose towards actions that actually contribute to improving our footprint on the climate. And here, the last point is that they are very complex. Every policy is different. Trade barriers are very different from budgetary support. And one has to look at this, and this goes back to the country level. The situation will be very country specific. Now, when we go to the repurposing options, again, at the global level, I mentioned that it is very complex. It's not a simple solution. So when you look at various options, what turns out is we look at some restructuring options, we look at conditionalities, we look at repurposing towards productivity enhancement. So these are broad buckets of different policies countries could potentially adopt and would have to be applied at the country level. At the global level, when we do this, what you see is that restructuring has limited gains. Environmental conditionality faces the same problems as removal, which is trade-offs, and which is extremely important from political food security and production point of view. The best bet we find for food security, poverty, and economy is to repurpose the current support, at least a small part of it, towards development, dissemination, and adoption of technologies and practices that actually target emissions reduction. And that would actually have a huge impact on the overall economy. $1.4 trillion in gain by 2040. We extend the model. We're actually using the same model working with IFPRI that FAO, UNDP, UNEP produced. And evaluating this, going a next step on evaluating the options, repurposing has huge payoffs. It increases food production by almost 14%, so it's good for food security. And it reduces poverty, whereas conditionalities, because they might have some impacts on outcomes, could actually negatively affect productivity and production, and that would be a big problem with this crisis. Finally, it does also deliver on the other goals that we all aspire towards: this nutrition, climate, and nature. And the gains are huge. The numbers are there. I don't want to go into details here. All I can say is, as far as nature is concerned, productivity growth would reduce land and agriculture by 105 million hectares. This is important for biodiversity for other reasons. It will save all of the 56 million that we expect to come into agriculture in the next 20 years, and also reduce the current emissions by 40. So these are huge gains. And the last thing is we should not forget the human capital development and skills. A lot of the money could be used, as Jonathan said, in other ways that benefit the rural producers and farmers, and it's a human development and skills. So to do this, as I said, it's very important to have global exchanges. We've been working with the UK government and with the Just Rural Transition, and FAO is part of that, and system is part of that, to look at how we can promote dialogue and mobilize action. In this context, we were actually also at the repurposing was a key part of the UN Food System Summit. Plus, we've been engaged in many other international fora. Finally, we've had a series of roundtables with the UK government and in the context of COP26, and we've developed, along with in a consultation with 31 countries, we have developed a policy action agenda that is to be launched at COP26. We would encourage all countries to look at this. It's a non-committal, it's a non-prescriptive framework of what countries could potentially do. It also lists out what international agencies countries can do. So now coming to the country specific, your question, sorry to take so long, but I thought those were important issues to kind of tie into the complexity of the problem, that it's not a simple solution. We understand all of the options would have to be country specific, and they would have to be tailored as I mentioned. The first step in this is basically policy dialogue and engagement, and the learning that comes from other countries to see that how other countries are doing it. Most countries are not in this all alone, and others are also facing the same problem. So there's a huge benefit to learning from each other. Then comes the issue of upstream analytical technical support. OECD does a great job, NAFAP at FAO does a great job, and IADB do a great job for a large number of countries. But many countries don't have this data. So we need to first build that database. So we work with countries. We are actually currently working with 11 countries, and we hope to work with others to sort of build up this database, identify the policies, how they're implemented, what the framework is. Unless you know what the problem is, you can't solve it. Second is to measure how these incentives affect, these policies affect the incentives of producers. Third is, so what can be done? So what are the impacts if you were to remove them? If you were to change policy. Then comes the issue of trade-offs. So what are the gains and losses? Who will win? Who will lose? What are the impacts of various policy objectives on looking at total wins? And this is where, after this analysis, comes the question of options that Marco had talked about. So where do we want to go? How each country will have its own solutions. We'll have to look at it in their own context and keep in mind the political economy and considerations in the sense that each option may have different impacts in different players. So how do we compensate them? How do we make sure that everybody's on board for the greater good? And that itself is very important to have the multi-stakeholder dialogues and consultations with the right people. At all of this, I just want to reiterate, in all of this, farmers have to be at the center of the process. Finally, the World Bank stands ready to mobilize and support countries along with our partners to mobilize the financial and technical support for moving from talk to action. So we need to actually start the implementation. And I think we are on record, also the UN Summit in New York, to say we are ready to support as many countries as want to move on this agenda. Thank you.
Maru, thank you so much for that intervention and for such the depth and breadth, also giving us overview and stressing, of course, the importance of the climate agenda in this, the challenges that are faced, but also the opportunities it presents if we're able to tackle the food systems and nutrition in helping to mitigate those climate challenges. So thank you so much for your input there. We are going to have to speed up just a little bit. So without further ado, I'm going to be introducing our next speaker, who we are very lucky to have here because he's not only an agronomist, but he is also the executive secretary of Senegal's National Food Security Council. So from both backgrounds, flexibly positioned and very well positioned to be able to answer these next questions and hopefully questions from our audience, which we would love to hear from you quite comfortably and effectively. So welcome, Mr. Jean-Pierre Senghor. Your Excellency, to get a country perspective on how to take step 3, and this is about designing the approach for reforming policies and subsidies, actually designing it, focused on step 3. Now, we've heard from the key findings of the report how allocating this expenditure investment is essential to repurpose. One of the key objectives of the institution you oversee, which is the National Food Security of Senegal, is to plan and design a coherent and effective public budget that can serve the purpose to ensure food security and nutrition in the country. So as the preface of the question, let's get to the crux of the question. Focusing on repurposing farm support, where do you feel public money should be redirected to ensure food security and healthier food systems in Senegal? And then what do you believe are the biggest challenges in reforming budgets? And what are the priority, the key, the main actions in overcoming them? Over to you, sir.
Merci beaucoup, Nathalie. J'espère que vous m'entendez bien parce que j'ai changé de
Yes, thank you. And just a reminder to...
I have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Just a reminder to those in the audience that you can press the English channel to listen to Mr. Senghor's English translation.
OK. Alors, bonjour à tous. Je suis très heureux, très ravi de participer à cette rencontre qui nous permet rapidement de présenter ce que le Sénégal fait et de ce que nous pensons faire comme réforme pour mieux réorienter nos budgets dans un soutien agricole qui est beaucoup plus efficace. Très rapidement, c'est très difficile en 5 minutes de dire tout ça. Je vais essayer en 5 minutes de résumer, puis après on reviendra certainement dans les détails quand il y aura des questions. Alors, je rappelle simplement que le Conseil national de sécurité alimentaire n'a pas pour mission seulement d'élaborer, de concevoir des budgets, notamment pour lutter contre l'insécurité alimentaire. Notre mission centrale, c'est évidemment de faire ce travail-là, mais également de coordonner l'ensemble des acteurs qui interviennent dans la lutte contre l'insécurité alimentaire dans le pays. Nous avons également pour mission de suivre l'ensemble des projets sur l'ensemble du territoire national. On en a aujourd'hui plus de 230. Donc, les suivre et les évaluer et de voir comment ces projets participent justement à la lutte contre l'insécurité alimentaire. Maintenant, pour répondre spécifiquement à la question, vous savez, nous, chaque année, nous menons des enquêtes. D'abord, la stratégie nationale de sécurité alimentaire est implémentée par un programme national d'appui à la sécurité alimentaire et à la résilience. Et au titre duquel programme, nous menons des enquêtes chaque année qui nous permettent d'élaborer la carte de la situation alimentaire du pays. Ça nous permet également d'estimer les populations aux prises avec l'insécurité alimentaire. Puis, à la fin de la journée, nous avons un plan de riposte que nous proposons au chef de l'État qui, lui, donne des indications pour accompagner les populations en insécurité alimentaire. Mais c'est une routine que nous faisons et qui, finalement, ne nous permet pas de régler les problèmes. En fait, on s'attaque souvent aux symptômes du mal, alors qu'il faudrait aller justement travailler à éradiquer ces questions-là à la source. Donc, aujourd'hui, ce qu'il y a, c'est qu'étant donné que depuis plusieurs années, nous faisons cela et ça ne règle pas totalement le problème, les propositions que le Conseil national de sécurité a eu à faire, au travers du programme national d'appui à la sécurité alimentaire, c'est de proposer en fait un sous-programme que nous avons appelé les nouveaux terroirs résilients. Comment travailler à rendre nos terroirs plus résilients, à rendre nos ménages beaucoup plus résilients, parce que vous savez, nous travaillons sur une entrée territoriale qui est le département administratif et une entité d'analyse qui est le ménage. Comment on peut travailler avec ces ménages-là pour que ces ménages soient résilients? Donc, il s'agit de réorienter les budgets vers un soutien accru aux exploitations familiales, que nous avons appelées des exploitations familiales résilientes. Au lieu de distribuer des vivres, il faut absolument que nous arrivions à renforcer nos exploitations familiales en commençant par les ménages les plus vulnérables, 1 hectare, 1 ménage, et puis s'assurer qu'il y a de l'eau, s'assurer qu'il y a de l'énergie solaire, pour qu'on puisse permettre à ces ménages-là de produire suffisamment pour que la consommation, en tout cas, puisque la sécurité alimentaire ne concerne pas que la production, mais puisqu'il s'agit de production agricole, nous allons traiter cette question-là. Donc, il faut que les ménages puissent produire suffisamment pour pouvoir disposer de produits alimentaires. Ensuite, il y a quelque chose que nous avons négligé ces dernières années, c'est le service agricole. C'est fondamental de soutenir le service agricole. Et le service agricole, nos États n'ont pas non seulement les moyens, mais les ressources humaines pour accompagner justement ce service agricole jusque dans les fermes les plus reculées. Comment moderniser et privatiser ce service agricole avec des jeunes qui sont formés, avec des unités mobiles qui leur permettent de se déplacer et d'offrir un service agricole payant? Voilà ce sur quoi on travaille, parce que c'est un binôme qui est gagnant. Si le service est payant et que la ferme est rentable, les deux peuvent se soutenir. Tout ceci est soutenu par un système d'information que nous avons appelé le système d'information sur les ressources de terroir. L'information, elle est capitale. Si vous n'avez pas l'information, vous n'avez pas les moyens d'agir. Donc voilà, en gros, ce sur quoi nous travaillons au Sénégal pour que les investissements publics soient réorientés vers ces aspects que je viens de vous signaler. Puisque j'ai atteint mes 5 minutes, je vais m'en arrêter là et puis je reviendrai certainement sur les questions avec plus de détails. Voilà, merci.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sengo. We really appreciate your insights and the very salient points that you touched upon there. Great that you are ready to answer questions. We do have questions coming in from our audience specifically for you, but we'll come back to that. So thank you so much for your inputs. You mentioned female households, female farmers there, a very salient point, and also the importance of supporting those households. Who we have next, and we are very honored to have you today as part of our panel discussion. As we have said before, Marco has underscored a repurposing strategy has to be inclusive of all actors and none more so than farmers. So of course, stakeholders engagement is intrinsic in all of the 6 steps which have been mentioned by Marco. And our next speaker, farming and agriculture have always been part of her working life. She has spent 10 years serving at the Italian farmers organization called Rethink, first in Rome, then in Brussels, acting as economic officer, secretary general of the Young Farmers, head of the president's technical secretariat, and finally as senior policy advisor at the European representation. And she's none other than the secretary general of the World Farmers Organization. Joining us here today, please welcome Arianna Giuliodori.
Thank you, Natalie. Very happy to be with you.
Arianna, so as we're advocating for a transition away from harmful, inequitable and ineffective subsidies towards farm support that is more effective and sustainable, especially in the long run, farmers are clearly the central actors in this transition, but it's often the smallholders, often the smallholders who are last in line for experiencing or in experiencing an equitable playing field in this scenario. So the question is, how can we then designing a repurposing strategy that is truly equitable, especially for smallholders and women? How can we do that? And how should we then deal with, as a number of our speakers have mentioned before, the natural trade-offs and the short-term negative impacts that could emerge from the phasing out or the overhauling of certain subsidy schemes when it comes to farmers? Arianna, over to you.
Thank you once more. Wow, what a powerful set of questions. And I feel honored to be part of this panel after listening to incredible inputs from the previous speakers. The easiest answer to your question would be that if the smallest and the most vulnerable are at the moment the last in line, the best way to proceed is to put them first in line and to start with them. If there's one lesson that we can keep from the UN Food System Summit is that farmers, producers, fishers are at the center of food systems. But simply saying this is not helping us. We must really listen to them for real, learn from them, from their knowledge. And how to do that? I'll try to focus on 3 points. So to be quick and to respect the time and hoping to get questions also from the audience. So first and foremost, we must put the farmers at the center. I told you, for real, which means we should once and forever abandon the rhetoric of smallholders as a poetic status and recognize that there's no poetry in being poor and hungry every night when you go to bed. So we must put the needs of the most vulnerable among the farming community at the heart of what we're doing by not only consulting them, but learning from their experiences. And probably the term smallholders is not helping us to identify who these people really are. And I'm particularly grateful to Monsieur Jean-Pierre Senghor that put the family farmers at the heart of these conversations, because farmers belong to families. Farmers are the real glue of rural communities. They are the reason why we have people still living on the countryside and in the most remote rural areas across the world. But we must make sure that we are able to identify for their real nature. So that's my first point. The second one, we should talk about agriculture and repurposing agricultural support in a truly systemic way. That's another outcome of the Food System Summit. So for the first time, finally, let me add, we've been approaching this topic in a holistic, in a systemic approach. But too often, farmers have been left alone to face the trade-offs that derive from the systemic approach. For instance, matching food security and climate change has been too often a burden left on the shoulders on each and every single family farmer that has to deal with an ever-changing climate that is affecting his or her activity every day. So there's no other way to do that than by changing the approach and putting all the actors around the table in defining what's the proper, the best choices to move further. And seen from our perspective, the farming community, what are these priorities? And with this, I'll come to an end. So I identified at least 4 streams, but there might be many more. We need to empower farmers' organizations in each and every country. We are facing a global challenge. We said that, but Maduro identified it clearly that the answers must happen at national level, at country level. We need in each and every country strong, powerful farmers' voices that can give to the governments, to the other stakeholders, the necessary information about needs and expectations and challenges that farmers, family farmers are facing. Secondly, we must invest on a research and innovation in a farmer-driven approach. We think that farmers have needs, expectations. Farmers also are innovating already their business every day, and there might be solutions that could support resilience, that could support better livelihoods that have not yet been explored. There's a huge and untapped potential in research and innovation. Third, we'd love to see finance, the financial sector, working closely with the farmers and the farmers community, and in particular with women and young farmers, to identify tools, financial tools that are meaningful to the farmers. Too often, finance is too far from the reality of a farmer or a farming family. And finally, farmers will always be economic actors that are also delivering incredible ecosystemic services. But if they are economic actors, they need markets that work properly. Local markets, international markets, whatever level, but we must be able to compete on a level playing field. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you so much, Ariana, for really bringing it home. And you referenced the UN Food System Summit. What I remember from that also is one of the constituencies who were present saying nothing about us without us. And I think that echoes very much the sentiment of what you're saying, is put farmers first in line. They have the answers. So thank you so much for a really great answer. We had a great question from the audience to you also. How does your optimum strategy look like to gain the various stakeholders' trust and support especially farmers. And I think you answered a large part of that question as well in that. So thank you so much. We may touch on that again, but I think I want to address a question now to Marco, who is also joining our panel. Thank you for staying. And I think that this is a question for Marco that perhaps Jonathan can add to. So the question is, how much of the 540 billion can be attributed to just a few countries? And how challenging will it be to engage those countries in repurposing spending towards sustainable food systems? Marco.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Let me just share this slide with you all. I trust you see this slide because it's very important to make a point here. This graph comes from the report, and basically I will not get into technicisms, but it actually reflects what we call the nominal rate of assistance. In a nutshell, it reflects how countries are supporting or disincentivizing agricultural producers, and by different measures: price incentives, output subsidies, input subsidies, and subsidies based on factors of production. Just to answer the question very punctual, and I'm very sure that Jonathan has things to add here, it's not so black and white, right? Obviously, there are many countries that are supporting, and probably they play a role in the big numbers, but we cannot just say that these are all developed countries. For example, there are middle-income countries that played a role, and believe it or not, there are countries like even in Africa that are supporting agriculture. But it's not so straightforward, because at the same time that there is a number of countries that are promoting this sector in different ways, I'm not talking about the outcomes of this sort of promotion. There are other countries that are also penalizing the agricultural sector. So we need to understand pretty well what is going on, and that is why country specificity matters. Now, how do we work with a country to, let's say, convince the governments that they should do this? Well, that's precisely one of the calls we are making, and we are all making here. Jonathan spoke about it as well, Madhur. I mean, we need to generate the evidences. We need to build the case. We need to build the case to show, well, if you have this budget this way, but you move it this other way, this is what you can get at that is much better for you, more cost effective, more environmentally friendly, more sustainable, and more promoting of healthier diets. So this is our task as international organizations. How do we start taking stock and analyzing? And this is actually part of the steps that we speak about in the report. We need to put out the evidence of these scenarios. What if we do this and we do that? And I believe that OECD, World Bank, FAO, UNEP, UNDP, we're all trying to work on this, try to show governments, let's work together, let's analyze the evidence. If we don't have data, we have to work also in investing in data. Over to you.
Thank you so much for answering that very salient and very important point, Marco. We have some great questions coming in, and I think what I would like to do is also, Jonathan, do you have anything briefly to add on what Marco was just saying?
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. You know, rather than share the complexities of sharing my slide, I clicked on a picture in the chat which decomposes the evolution of the amount of resources that are transferred to producers over a 20-year period. And it shows how much that story has changed, because that's a very good question. It's changed enormously. If we look 20 years ago, the story was essentially one of OECD country protection and the effect that those policies had on international markets. Now, what we've seen is that there was some reform in OECD countries over the years 2000 to 2010, and that process is effectively stalled in the last 10 years. So there's an outstanding reform agenda that has not been consolidated in the last 10 years in OECD countries. But what you'll see if you look at that graph is that the numbers are going up in emerging economies, in particular China. China is becoming hugely important to the global total. And it's going to be reform in those countries that becomes equally important, and the repurposing agenda becomes as important in emerging economies as it is in OECD countries. So it's a complex story, but of course, in terms of global impacts, it's the bigger economies that tend to matter. And you'll see from that graph, China, of course, is hugely important to the whole story.
Jonathan, thank you so much for your input on that, for your valuable insight. And now, Your Excellency, Mr. Senghor, we have a question from the audience for you. And the question is how to prepare farmers for repurposing. Again, in the audience, if you want to hear Mr. Senghor's answer, please press the English channel button for translation. And the question to you is, how to prepare farmers for repurposing. And this is oftentimes because the opposition parties and the industry players, the ones that would be affected by such repurposing, resist such reforms and resist the repurposing by mobilizing farmers against such changes. So how would you like to respond to this? We have about 10 minutes left and we're going to do another round of questions. But sir, what would be your response to this very salient and important and difficult question?
Comment préparer les agriculteurs à accepter les réformes? Je crois que, de ma connaissance, ça fait 30 ans que je suis dans le métier, en Afrique notamment. Je n'ai pas tellement assisté à des résistances fortes lorsque ces réformes-là vont dans l'intérêt des producteurs. Jamais les producteurs ne s'opposent à des réformes qui vont dans leur intérêt. Et il faut aussi informer correctement, parce qu'on n'arrive pas du jour au lendemain et on balance des réformes comme ça. Il faut une approche beaucoup plus inclusive, beaucoup plus participative, qui tienne compte effectivement de leurs pratiques à eux. Mais attention, j'ai entendu tout à l'heure une question qui parlait de la prise en compte du savoir-faire traditionnel. Je crois qu'il faut aussi éviter de surestimer la capacité de nos producteurs à prendre en charge certaines questions qui arrivent comme ça, comme des chocs dus au changement climatique. Il y a des gens dont c'est le métier et qui sont censés effectivement donner l'information juste. La prise en charge de l'information climatique aussi, elle est centrale. Donc, encore une fois, pour cette réponse, pour cette question, il faut discuter avec les gens. À partir du moment où la réforme, les gens l'ont bien comprise et bien acceptée, bien intégrée, il y a très rarement des résistances. Les réformes doivent se faire avec eux, pas contre eux. Voilà. Et quand c'est comme ça se passe plutôt bien.
Thank you so much for your input. And now I think what we're going to do is, as we have about 4 minutes left, I'm going to go around to our and ask for your input on this question very briefly. If you can give this to me in a line or two, we have a 4-minute cutoff here. So Madhu, starting with you. For repurposing agricultural producer support, it takes time to think, to test, to implement, and to innovate ways of supporting farmers. My question to you, and I would like to open it to everyone, I'm going to cut you off at, going to have to cut you off at 10 past, but very quickly in a line or two, what is the timeline? If a country were to start next year, when can they expect, in your opinion, to see results or impacts? What kind of timeline do we need? Madhu, you first.
I think that depends. Yeah, can you hear me?
Now I can, thank you.
Yeah, timeline, it can be as fast as the stakeholders. I guess the process depends on how soon we can buy all the stakeholders. Now, everybody here, Ariana, I can't agree with Ariana more. Farmers have to be at the table. And if they don't understand it, and other stakeholders, it's not only the farmers, others have to come in. As soon as there is consensus, I think the governments can move immediately. There are governments, EU has taken a long time, but they've been going at it for a long time. China has done reforms, has started doing some reforms. And so the other countries have different experiences. But this is where I think consensus building and getting everybody on board with proper analytics and giving them information, I think is the most important part. And you can go as fast as you want.
As fast as you want. Madhu, thank you so much for that great input. Ariana, over to you. What is your response on the kind of timeline that you think this can be done?
Don't take me as provocative, Natalie, but I will answer by saying that it depends on how much you want to invest to fund the transition, because time is necessary to get the consensus for sure. So I agree with Madhur, but here the point is, are we ready to support farmers in transitioning to a different approach? So that would be my answer.
Thank you so much for that input, Ariana. And we are all about being provocative. People sometimes need to be provoked into action, and that's what we're here to do, but also to engage and to give solid examples. So thank you so much for that. Jonathan, what would be your response in less than a minute?
Less than a minute. I think.
Or a minute.
On the price distortions is signing to reduce it. That can be done very quickly. The budget element is another story. But we saw with the COVID pandemic that governments earmarked a lot of money for support in response to COVID. In the resources that we see reallocated, expenditure ex post risk management programs, spending doubled from 20 to 40 billion. So that was a kind of ex post, let's cope with the shock after it's occurred. You could spend that money much more effectively on building resilience to future shocks, long-term investments that would pay off. But you see how quickly the governments did act with respect to COVID. They can act quickly on the repurposing agenda as well.
Thank you, Jonathan, for reminding us of that. And now, very quickly, Jean-Pierre Senghor, what is your response on the timeline? We have 30 seconds. That's a challenge.
Ça, c'est une question à 30 secondes qui coûte cher. Je crois que, en fait, si vous regardez l'agenda 2030, on se demande si on va y arriver. Mais je crois qu'à l'échelle en 5 ans, on peut arriver à faire des réformes qui tiennent la route dans un pays comme le Sénégal. 5 ans. Maximum.
Thank you so much. There we have it on record. It can be done. Marco, do you want to add anything before we go to the closing remarks from Maximo Torero, Chief Economist at the FAO?
Yeah, well, let me say something that I hope it doesn't sound so revolutionary, but just based on the experience of FAO recently, you know, many of the scenarios unavoidably will be based on modeling work, where you compare what would happen if, right? What we are doing in FAO that seems to be moving reforms very quickly, fairly quickly, is we are designing these scenarios with both policymakers and stakeholders, meaning we're asking farmers, what do you know about this potential investment and the productivity? And believe it or not, we are translating this information from the farmers to what we call in the modeling parameters, how to simulate these things. So we are being informed by them. And this is the new way of going, designing scenarios with both policymakers and farmers and other stakeholders on repurposing agricultural producer support. We are doing it, so it's doable.
It's doable. Thank you so much. Quotable quotes all around. It can be done. The moral of the story, the best time to start was yesterday. The next best time is today. So that's a strong message there to all the countries. Thank you so much to our fantastic panelists. And now I do apologize to Maximo Torero, Chief Economist at the FAO, but over to you without any further ado for the takeaways and closing remarks. Thank you, Maximo.
No, thank you very much, Natalie, for a great panel and for a great management of the panel. I think this has been extremely good, and you did a great job of moderation. And this is exactly the kind of support FAO wants to see, helping and working hand in hand with partners and countries to transform the agri-food system. It is easy to talk about what must be done, but today we have to together work on how we can do it and how we can create the action at the level of the countries. And I really like the steps that were presented to be able to show how this can be implemented. But I will suggest that not all the steps have to be sequential. Some of them can be done in simultaneous, because one of the major problems in this topic is outside of the step 1 and 2, which is basically having the data for which, as it was mentioned, there is a consortium in place with IFPRI, with FAO, with OECD, with the World Bank, and we can increase an IDB and increase the number of partners. We need to have that for sure. But all the part of creating awareness of the problem and the challenges are extremely important, because sometimes the actors in the field believe something which not necessarily is correct. And they believe that their subsidies or the support that they are getting is really creating a benefit from them, which not necessarily is the case. And that's why we need to create this awareness so that we can have a movement towards the change and political pressure to make this possible, because if not, it will be extremely, extremely difficult to resolve that. And agricultural support from governments is not a new issue, but it's a long overdue homework to dive deep into it. It's a hard one to tackle because it is charged with political economic considerations and the way to go about it. And that's why this simultaneous move in terms of awareness is central. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres at the opening of the CFS on Monday told us get to work and deliver on the food systems for today's realities. So on repurposing, we got to work, and the fact that several leading institutions, policymakers, and the World Farmers Organizations are here with us today shows that there is momentum. I am confident that the following momentum from the Food System Summit with COP26 just around the corner and today's event on CFS, governments will move back and repurposing of agricultural support will be something on the major agenda. Indeed, it is in their interest, both socially and economically, to do so. And undeniably, the economic recession from the pandemic and its knock-on effects also play a role where big governments are having to rethink how to best allocate the limited resources. So as governments rethink and realize that the support as usual scenario is no longer valid, they can take advantage of the momentum, tools, and guides like ours today to overhaul and repurpose support for the benefit of farmers, the environment, and the human health. And this is a new system approach, which is something that the summit has pushed for, and it's something that we are working intensively with our partners, and it's something that gives you a different way of looking at it. You have an objective function, which is achieving SDG 2, but you have trade-offs, which touches many other SDGs on water, soil, land, and environment, and that's what we need to take into account. So allow me to mention a few takeaways from the countries, for countries to consider from today's how-to. First, the need to shift from distorting and harmful forms of agricultural support towards support measures that are decoupled from production, that improve productivity, and that will help us to achieve the goals that we want to achieve for better health and nutrition outcomes, while striving better in equality, especially for smallholder farmers. Second, we also need to boost budget allocations on public goods and services. And I am underscoring here infrastructure and research and development. We did a study and we showed that they pay back enormously to reduction of hunger and chronic undernourishment. And that needs to be developed and have a different timeline. That's another dimension that we need to think. The timeline of the impact. Sometimes subsidies have a very short-term return, but has a negative consequence in the future. Research and development will take time. And that's where we need to think on discount rates and how we can make them in the common metric. And that's something very important that policymakers need to take into consideration. All stakeholders must come together to mitigate as much as possible inevitable trade-offs, as I mentioned before. Measures such as cash transfer schemes will need to be put in place to address short-term implications of repurposing, because there will be losers and winners. The UN Secretary General on Monday assured countries that they have the full force of the UN family standing with them to deliver the food systems our world so desperately needs. We are doing just this. The UNDP, UNEP, and FAO worked together on a landmark report launched in September, and the findings of which has been discussed here today. There are other initiatives going on around the world for the same goal. One of them is a solution cluster and the action track 3 of the Food System Summit, and this is now evolving into a coalition, and FAO supports these endeavors. Through FAO monitoring and analyzing food agricultural policies, the MAFAD program, we are also working with several countries to reform agricultural support and design more optimal ways of allocating budgets and swifter agri-food system transformation. Finally, the repurposing agenda will continue well into the 2022. This is not a year issue. And what we have decided with our partners, IFA, WFP, WHO, and UNICEF, and of course FAO, is that the next State of Food Security and Nutrition, the SOFI report, will see how repurposing of food and agricultural policies and incentives can bring about cost reductions for nutritious food and make healthy diets more affordable to the world's population, because today 3 billion people don't have access to healthy diets, and we need to change this. There is a human right of access to food, and this doesn't make any sense. And if we have resources already allocated through the budgets of the governments, and we can bring solid evidence that those resources are not giving the results that you expect, and can be changed and reshuffled to better options, I think that's a very concrete way to move forward to achieve the goal of access to healthy diets without having to go through all a political process of increasing budgets and changing budgets. So I think this is a win-win situation where we can put a lot of effort, bring evidence, and work politically with governments to try to create a change. So let me just finalize by thanking all the panelists, Jean-Pierre Senghor, Ariana Giuliodori, Jonathan Brooks, Madhur Gautam from the bank, Marco Sanchez, of course, and to you, Natalie, for the great moderation, and to all the organizers of the FAO Agri-Food Economic Division and colleagues from UNDP and UNEP. And finally, to the CFS Secretariat for granting us this side event today. So thank you very much.
Maximo, thank you so much for your kind closing remarks and for bringing up so strongly and starkly the aspect of the importance of human rights in this, which came through so strongly from all of our speakers. You have thanked them individually, but again, thank you to our esteemed panel of speakers, the organizers, Craig and Valentina, and to all the organizations who put this event together today, and to you, importantly, our audience. We know that we had stakeholders here and countries here today, and this organization is keen and want to help with your repurposing. So remember that all of the information also is available to you. Check in the chat box as well for any links or any outreach or connections. And we wish you well with this important work till we meet again. Thank you for joining us.